At 3:57 a.m. the Luftwaffe radar screens showed something strange, a solid white smear moving at the speed of a storm. At first they thought it was a system fault. An hour later it was clear, this was no fault. This was the sky, moving. Northern France held its breath. June 1944 wore a grey dawn like a shroud, clouds bandaged low from Cherbourg to the Orne. In headquarters the air smelled of pencil shavings, damp wool, cold coffee. Maps lay heavy with pins and thumbtacks. A clerk chalked the weather, overcast, drizzle, westerly, then underlined it, as if to close the day. In Cannes, a radioman named Weber hunched over green scopes in a room that hummed with current. The paper drum ticked, needles scratching the familiar blips of night traffic. Then the static unbuttoned. A blunt, continuous bloom spread across the cathode like milk spilled on slate. He tapped the glass, recalibrated. The smear remained, thick, unbroken, advancing with each sweep. "We aren't seeing aircraft," he told the duty officer, careful, as if volume might make the mark run. "We're seeing weather." Out in the town, bakers shoved loaves into hot mouths of brick ovens, the streets smelled of yeast and coal. A motorcycle coughed, failed, coughed again. The river slid past with poplar fluff and bits of ash. Across the channel, airfields glistened under floodlights. Hangar doors yawned, briefings shook the glass in their frames. Maps were chalked with bridges and causeways, code words written so square they turned jokes into orders. Mechanics signed off in grease, initials, dates, tiny prayers, and thumped cowlings with gloved knuckles. "Today," the commander said, closing his folder like a verdict, "the sky will be ours." Engines coughed, caught, harmonized into a rolling chant that seemed to speak one word, now. Propwash combed the grass flat. Dew beaded along wing edges as ground crews yanked chocks and jogged clear. In a thunderbolt a pilot nudged a photograph back under the compass. Weber watched the smear become a wall. Reports arrived like falling cutlery, Rouen, Fécamp, Le Havre. Bearings matched the English coast in a neat arc. The duty officer lifted his eyes from the map. "If it's weather," he said, "it favors the enemy." On the beaches, sentries stamped warmth into their feet and pretended indifference to the sea. They had been promised an invasion so long that the promise had soured into myth. Inland, cows raised heads, dogs barked without conviction, then with it. The countryside listened. Takeoffs began like beads poured from a giant's hand. Bombers rolled, struck the same bump on the runway, lifted at almost the same second, a mathematical hymn. Transports queued with doors breathing open and shut. The line did not end, it turned a corner in the mind and went on, beyond counting. German telephones lost their patience. The smear found a voice, a braided thunder, not from the ground but from the upper air, from the place farmers keep for weather and priests keep for God. Orders moved like rituals from a world already shrinking: conserve ammunition, report altitudes, hold fire till positive ID. A captain folded his sister's letter and slid it into his breast pocket as if paper could stop what was coming. The trap, when it closed, did not spring from trenches or mines. It arrived as a ceiling. Mass descended, number, motion, will, until windows rattled in parishes that had never seen more than a handful of planes. Children woke and named it a storm. Weber took off his headphones and still heard the sound, it traveled through concrete and bone. Certainty at the map tables, built on earth, on fields and angles, began to leak. What approached could not be grasped, only endured. The realization moved like a chill: this was not a battle forming, this was the weather changing sides. By dawn the sky held more than 5,000 aircraft, each one vibrating the morning into a new shape. And each carried a piece of the story that would change the world. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. For 30 AMM, the channel was a single dark instrument, strings tuned to wind and engine. Clouds hung low and close, stitched with salt and the faintest wet metal smell that found its way into throats. Running lights blinked dull through mist, red, until the formation became a constellation with rules. The C-47s held level in the black, wings steady as held breath, and the crews spoke in hand signs that were half ritual, half superstition. Inside one of the transports a private named Mark Johnson cupped his helmet straps like reins. He later wrote in a notebook the size of a pocket Bible, "We flew through cloud and the cloud lit up from within, lit by our own tracers, like lightning we'd made ourselves." In the dim cargo bay, chalk lines on jackets glowed faint and ghostly. Sweat gathered at the base of the spine where the harness dug. The air tasted of canvas, oil, old coffee. Someone retched neatly into a paper bag and tied it off like a secret. The jumpmaster stood braced at the door, fingers white on the frame, the slipstream combing his sleeves flat. The green earth below might as well have been another planet. The only geography that mattered now was the distance from the red light to the green, from the floor to the void. Johnson's leg bounced against the static line. He stilled it with both hands and looked at the man opposite, who kept blinking as if he could open his eyes wide enough to see through night. On the radio net, clipped voices told a story with missing pages. Crosswinds. A stray beacon. The coast was a rumor you could hear in the prop beats. Navigators traced new paths with pencils that left grooves even when the graphite snapped. The pilots flew low, lower, skimming the dark like fishermen running a shoal, throttles nudged and renudged as if touch could bargain with weather. The first bursts of flak wrote blind punctuation across the sky. There were no shapes, only the sensation that the night had bones and they were breaking. A tracer skipped across a wing and vanished, paint scorched but held. In another aircraft a lamp blew and the cockpit went church dark, instruments suddenly the only stars. The pilot spoke the way you speak to a child who's hurt, soft, even, then held his heading like it was a promise he could keep. "Stand up." The jumpmaster's voice was clear as a bell in a small room. "Hook up." Carabiners clicked into the overhead cable like a zipper closing on fear. Boots spaced on yellow tape, knuckles widening around webbing, the smell of gun oil and cold air. The red light stared. It stared long enough for a man to build a private world between beats of his heart, long enough for him to inventory who he had been up to that second. Green. Weight changed into motion with the neatness of a switch thrown. Bodies became shapes, shapes became absence, the aircraft spat them into wind that clawed and slapped and, finally, held. The sound outside the door was a living thing, a chorus that drowned everything but the body's insistence on survival. Johnson fell into it and the chute cracked open with a punch that yanked a curse out of him. The first knowledge was cold. The second was that he was alone in a sky where distances lied. Parachutes bloomed and scattered. Some opened low over hedgerows and ponds, others hung high and slow, easy targets for nerves and stray bullets. A stick dropped into a flooded meadow, the water taking them like a second sky, black and bottomless. One man cut himself free and his hands would not stop shaking, not even when he reached reed and mud. Another landed on a slate roof and skidded down into a courtyard where a woman in a nightdress looked at him the way you look at an animal in the wrong season. In the hedgerow labyrinth the country had made for itself, men whispered passwords and got countersigns wrong. The map in the pocket matched only the idea of Normandy, the real one smelled of damp earth and crushed nettle, apple blossom knocked to the ground, manure souring in ditches. A calf bawled and was shushed by a farmer who didn't yet know which side mercy would be counted on. Mist thinned towards the east. In that strip of paling sky, fighter-bombers began to hunt, typhoons with big chins and spiteful grace, thunderbolts shouldering through air like linebackers, rockets tucked under wings like unspoken threats. They ran rail lines and crossroads, kissed the tops of trees. The C-47s turned back for more loads, steady as freight trains, the fighters stayed and made daylight a harder thing for anyone on the wrong road. German sentries learned the new weather by ear. A report drafted in pencil and improved with fear made its way to a village commandant. The air hums like the sea. This is the sky against us. They fired where the sound was thickest, and the sound moved. At a crossroads near St. Mireglise, two paratroopers found one another by the smell of the same lube on their rifles and a little Ohio in the shape of their vowels. They folded into a ditch as a staff car hissed past, lights blacked, a cigarette ember the only reckless thing in France. Navigation errors became fate. A pathfinder beacon blinked one field to the left, an entire stick planted itself in the wrong orchard and then made that orchard the right one by deciding to hold it. On a causeway, a man with a face red from wind yelled himself hoarse into a handset that whistled like a kettle. Somewhere, a chaplain cut risers with a knife he'd sharpened on a mess tin months ago, every stroke now a debt paid. Johnson gathered his chute like a wounded bird and shouldered it, heart still insisting on telling him where his chest was. He heard a farm pump squeak, a dog bark once, twice, then the kind of silence a field makes when it realizes men have fallen into it. He checked his compass. It couldn't tell him where friends were, only where north was, and that felt like a poor bargain but better than none. Far overhead the stream of transports kept threading the dark. Somewhere a house clock struck 5. Dawn prepared to make everyone honest. And a German soldier, riding by window light that made his knuckles look like stones, put down a sentence he would not cross out: they did not come from the sea. They fell from the sky. Morning came slow, reluctant, like a curtain too heavy to lift. Between 6 and 7, the coast of Normandy stopped being a map and became an anatomy: flesh, bone, smoke. The sea was bruised with oil slicks, the air smelled of salt and iron. Fog rolled low, thick enough to taste, carrying the bitter tang of cordite and the sweetness of burning wheat. From Cannes to Bayeux, the sky flickered with orange veins. It looked alive. Above that trembling horizon came the bombers, Lancasters, B-17s, B-24s, each dragging its own shadow across the clouds. Their engines beat in heavy waves that struck the chest before the ears. Inside one, an English gunner, Tom Keats, pressed his face to the glass and muttered, "We're flying over the edge of the world." Below, the coast was gone, erased by smoke. The sky itself had become their compass. In the bunkers, men shouted orders that vanished into thunder. Sand sifted from the ceilings, paint blistered from heat. A German artilleryman, Schult, 19, swung the barrel of his .88 by instinct. Fewer. The recoil shook his bones. He didn't know if he hit anything. "We fired blind," he wrote later. "We saw no planes, only sound. Bombs fell by the hundreds. The ground split and folded, trenches collapsing like paper. For seconds at a time, the fog seemed to burn, glowing like a furnace behind the smoke. The earth rose and fell as if breathing through pain. In the air, American pilot Bill Gardner clenched the control column until his gloves squeaked. The B-24 quivered, metal groaning under strain. Below was the sea, above the clouds, and between them, hell. His bombardier, a kid from Michigan, counted down, 3, 2, 1, Gardner never heard the release. The noise outside swallowed everything. When he looked back, another plane half a mile away turned into a black flower of fire. No parachutes, just debris, dark against the orange light. Fragments rained on both sides, burnt fabric, metal shards, scraps of maps that fluttered briefly before sinking in mud. To soldiers on the beaches it looked like weather gone mad, black petals drifting from the sky. In Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, a woman hiding under her stairs reached toward the window. Her fingers came back wet with oil. Only then she realized it wasn't rain. By 6:45, visibility was gone. Smoke and fog thickened until day itself felt drowned. Gunners fired by instinct, muzzle flashes lighting their faces in snapshots of terror. One man wiped his rangefinder lens, it smeared instead. "Aim at the sound," the sergeant ordered. All the sound. All of it. Above, confusion ruled. Flares drifted off course. Radios spat static. Bombs dropped too early, too far, sometimes on their own lines. Gardner glimpsed a typhoon slicing beneath his wing, rockets flashing out, and then saw a second explosion. His tail gunner's turret had vanished. The air changed color. Smoke and moisture turned bronze, swallowing all distance. Inside it, everything looked near, until it wasn't. Keats later swore the sky felt alive, breathing against the glass of his turret. It was watching us, he said. On the ground, Schultz crawled from his dugout. The sound never stopped. He saw a shard of shrapnel smoking in a tree and thought, this is the earth speaking. Around him, dunes had become pits, men moved through them like ghosts. Somewhere a field gun burned quietly, its barrel glowing red. Gardner's bomber turned north, fuel low. Through the quivering fuselage he saw only vertical columns of smoke. The land seemed to boil. He wondered if anything could live in that, and then remembered there were still men down there, crawling through fire. At 7:10, the bombing stopped, not because targets were destroyed, but because the sky was too crowded to continue. Engines crossed paths within meters, radio silence turned to chaos. The last wave dropped its load at random and vanished west, engines fading like heartbeats behind the smoke. For a moment, silence tried to settle, but it was the wrong kind. It pulsed. The air stank of oil and hot iron. A cow wandered from a collapsed barn, its hide gray with ash. It stopped beside a crater full of black water, steam rising from its surface. By 8 o'clock, Normandy had no sky left, only a dark ceiling where the world above and below had fused. Through that burning haze, far beyond the clouds, another wave was already forming. And this was only the beginning. Between 7 and 9 that morning, the sky above Normandy was no longer a place, it was an engine. Every vibration, every shout, every radio burst fused into one metallic roar. In the underground Luftwaffe command post near Cannes, the walls trembled as if the air itself had weight. Dust drifted from the ceiling with each explosion miles away. Maps shook on their pins. The smell of oil, sweat, and ozone filled the room. Major Klaus Reinhardt leaned over the microphone, voice raw. "Where are our fighters? Why don't we see them?" Static answered. Then, faintly, a voice half-eaten by interference, "Radio dead. They're jamming everything." The line went flat, no hiss, no heartbeat. Silence, the cruelest kind. Reinhardt stared at the receiver, unwilling to believe silence could be that complete. Outside, clouds rolled like smoke from a forge. A lone Spitfire cut through the haze, its wings flashing silver. Lieutenant James Carter flew low enough to see waves breaking over landing craft. "I've never seen the sky so alive," he whispered into his mask, "and so terrifying." Above him, Allied bombers streamed in endless rows, living architecture of noise and motion. Below, the beaches bled fire and men. In the German bunker, operators wrestled with dead radios. Needles quivered without reason. Frequencies overlapped until the room sounded like 1,000 ghosts screaming through tin. One officer tore off his headset, blood darkening the skin behind his ear. Another kept writing on scraps of paper that no longer mattered. Every message arrived too late to mean anything. At 7:40, the first Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s clawed into the air. Their takeoff was a small act of defiance, engines coughing, propellers kicking up grass and dust. For a moment the base felt alive again. Mechanics waved them off, shouting through the thunder. Then the horizon erupted. British and American fighters spotted the climbing dots and dove like hawks. Cannon fire tore white lines through the morning. One German plane burst into flame before its wheels even retracted. Another spiraled down, trailing smoke that painted the clouds. A survivor later said, "We rose to the sky, and the sky was gone. It belonged to them." Back in Cannes, Reinhardt's staff listened to fragments of chaos. Gunfire bled through the static, sharp and far away. "They're feeding our own voices back at us," one operator yelled. "They're inside the frequencies." Reinhardt rubbed his temples. "Then we are deaf," he said quietly, "and blind." Typists left their posts. A young orderly laughed, high, brittle, frightening. "They've stolen the air itself," he muttered, staring at the ceiling as if expecting it to fall. No one corrected him. High above, Carter's Spitfire banked through trails of smoke. The air shimmered with contrails curling into knots. German formations broke apart like glass. Below, the sea was dotted with wreckage, aircraft pieces, oil fires, bodies. He wanted to feel triumph, but all he felt was the sick weight of inevitability. By 8:15, the Luftwaffe's defense had collapsed. A few remaining fighters fled inland, chased by thunderbolts that looked impossibly large, like predators from another world. A final radio burst reached Ken before vanishing into static: "We are overwhelmed." Repeat, overwhelmed. No one heard the rest. Reinhardt stood before the trembling wall map, pins rattling in their sockets. "We had order," he murmured. "We had a plan." A lieutenant answered softly, "The plan required a sky, sir." The words hung there, heavier than the explosions. Carter circled once more before turning west. Through gaps in the smoke he saw the ruins of a German airfield, hangars burning, fuel tanks erupting one after another. Over the radio, voices tangled, commands, prayers, static. He switched channels, the noise followed. Even the airwaves were occupied territory. At 8:45, one last transmission sputtered through the German network: "All units hold position. Await instructions." No instructions came. The channel died mid-word. Reinhardt removed his headset slowly, like handling a fragile relic. "It's finished," he said. "The air belongs to them." Outside, the noise softened to a distant hum, the sound of engines moving inland, steady and unstoppable. For the first time in years, the Luftwaffe had no sky to command. Within hours of the invasion's beginning, Germany's greatest weapon, coordination, had ceased to exist. The war in the air ended before they even understood it had begun. By 9:30, the airfields of northern France no longer looked like places built by men. They looked like bones, burnt, twisted, stripped of meaning. Smoke coiled upward from hangars that had once smelled of fuel and coffee, now only ash. Concrete runways shimmered with heat from nearby fires. The sky above Evreux was still trembling, a slow aftershock of engines that had passed hours ago but left their echo imprinted in the air. Captain Otto Weiss sat on the edge of a crater, his headset around his neck, his hands black with grease. He could still hear phantom voices in the static. Someone behind him shouted for fuel trucks, though everyone knew there was no fuel left to move. The tanks had been drained days earlier, rerouted to the armored divisions near Paris. "We have aircraft," Weiss said quietly, "but no sky to give them." Inside the command hut, papers were scattered like snow, weather reports, sortie schedules, all useless now. The phone lines were dead. Outside, the few surviving pilots stood waiting beside their machines, faces smeared with soot. The airfield had become a stage where nothing would start again. At 9:45, a new sound rolled in, low, predatory, familiar. Thunderbolts. The Americans came in from the west, flying low enough for the pilots to see the fear on the ground. One mechanic tried to wave a red cloth, but the gesture disappeared in a blur of tracer fire. Bullets tore through fuel drums, flames rose in sheets. A pilot sprinted toward his FW-190, ducking behind the wing just as a rocket hit the hangar behind him. The blast threw him forward, ears bleeding. When he stood, his aircraft was gone, melted into black metal curls. He would later write, "After that morning, we no longer saw the sky as ours." From the ruins, Weiss crawled into a trench, pressing his hands over his head as another pass of rockets split the air. The ground shook with the precision of a metronome. Every second explosion felt timed to a heartbeat. When the noise finally faded, he looked up and saw the horizon moving, columns of smoke drifting east, carrying with them everything that had once been pride. Meanwhile, at 20,000 feet, American pilots flew through the same smoke, their instruments coated in a thin layer of ash. Lieutenant Raymond Hale adjusted his oxygen mask and looked down through the haze. "It's hard to tell what's alive," he said into his intercom. Below, burning towns flickered like embers under glass. Roads writhed with vehicles trying to escape, trucks, tanks, horses. To the airmen, they looked like lines on a map slowly erasing themselves. A pilot to Hale's right broke radio silence. "They're done. Look at them burn." Hale didn't answer. He watched the tracers cut through the fog and thought of home, how his younger brother had asked if flying meant freedom. "It means not being human for a while," Hale had told him, half joking. Now, watching the roads below dissolve into fire, the joke felt cruel. Over Évreux, the attack lasted less than 15 minutes. When it ended, the Luftwaffe base was a graveyard, smoking wrecks, scattered helmets, the faint whine of ruptured metal cooling in the sun. In the control tower, a single radio sputtered to life, broadcasting fragments of Mozart from some distant civilian frequency. No one had the strength to turn it off. At 10:10, a convoy of German fuel trucks finally arrived from the south, too late, too visible. The lead vehicle exploded before it reached the gate. The rest swerved into ditches. Flames licked at the grass, spreading in bright veins across the field. Weiss ran toward the nearest wreck, trying to drag a driver out through the window. The man's boots left black marks on the ground. When Weiss looked up, the sky was empty. He couldn't tell if that was better or worse. In another part of France, the surviving radar operators wrote in their logs, "Stations silent. Equipment destroyed." Their last entry was a single word, "blind." From the air, Hale's squadron turned north toward the channel. The sunlight pierced through the fading smoke, revealing what they had done in cruel clarity. "We're supposed to feel proud," someone said over the radio. No one replied. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of engines. As they crossed the coastline, Hale glanced back. Behind them, the fields burned in perfect patterns, neat as grid lines. It looked almost organized, as if destruction itself had been planned. He thought of the German pilots on the ground, men his age, maybe younger, and for the first time since dawn, his hands trembled on the control stick. In the ruined base below, Weiss found a piece of metal shaped like a wingtip and turned it over in his hands. It was still warm. Around him, the surviving crewmen gathered in silence. Somewhere beyond the smoke, church bells rang, distant, mechanical, absurdly calm. "We were supposed to be ready," someone muttered. Weiss didn't answer. Readiness had become a word with no meaning. By 11, the fires had begun to choke themselves out. The air smelled of oil and scorched grass. Overhead, the sky cleared, blue, beautiful, and indifferent. For the first time, it was truly empty. That morning, the Luftwaffe lost the sky. But with it, they also lost the illusion that war could still be controlled by men. By 11 o'clock, the sea was no longer just water, it was a machine, endless and metallic, grinding toward the French coast. Over Omaha Beach, air and earth had fused into one shaking body of smoke and thunder. The sky trembled with leftover noise, the air thick with salt, oil, and blood. Waves rolled in carrying pieces of men, wood, and steel. From a half-flooded landing craft, Private Daniel Mercer stared upward instead of forward. Squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts circled above the haze, patient and predatory. Their engines hummed like gods clearing their throats. The sky roared, he would write later. We couldn't even hear our own boots on the sand. When the ramp fell, sound hit like a hammer. The air turned solid with shock waves. Mercer stumbled into waist-deep water, then ran without knowing where. Explosions threw hot spray across his face. Between bursts of smoke, he saw Allied planes diving from the clouds, sleek, bright, merciless. They looked like gods, he thought. But gods with fire. Above, Mustangs strafed bunkers, Typhoons unleashed rockets into the bluffs. Each pass of a fighter sent a pulse of wind across the beach, flattening flags and men alike. Some soldiers looked up as if for reassurance, only to see the sky itself burning. On the ridge, German officer Friedrich Alten peered through his binoculars from a shattered observation post. His hands shook too much to focus. Through the haze, dark silhouettes swarmed the air, thousands, endless. "It has betrayed us," he whispered. "Even the sky belongs to them now." Mercer crawled behind an overturned Higgins boat. The metal was hot, stinking of fuel. A body lay beside him, radio still hissing. He pressed the earpiece to his head, only static, then fragments of code drowned beneath the constant thunder. At 11:40, a squadron of B-26 Marauders appeared from the west, bomb bay doors yawning open. For a heartbeat everything paused, then the ground split open again. Sand, steel, and bone lifted together before crashing back down in one monstrous breath. Alton stumbled outside as plaster rained from the ceiling. "Report," he shouted. No answer. The line was dead. The beach below writhed with movement, ships, smoke, broken machines. Above it, the aircraft drifted with cold precision, erasing the map with every pass. Mercer reached the base of the cliff and pressed his palms into soil vibrating from the impact of shells. A medic ran past carrying a man whose legs were gone. The wounded soldier's eyes stayed fixed on the sky, whispering something Mercer couldn't hear. "They're covering us," the medic shouted. Mercer nodded, though he didn't know if it was true. By noon, the sun was only a rumor. Smoke rolled so thick it changed the color of light. The air tasted of copper and ash. Men shouted not to be heard but to remind themselves they still existed. Overhead, the planes kept coming, each roar a reminder that survival depended on something invisible and far away. Alton lowered his binoculars. His guns were silent, buried under debris. The sea kept bringing more ships, more men. He whispered, "It doesn't stop. Even when it's gone, it doesn't stop." Mercer reached a collapsed seawall and crouched with a handful of survivors. Around them lay rifles, helmets, canteens half filled with seawater. He looked up again. The sky wasn't blue or gray now, just pale smoke streaked with contrails. He couldn't tell where heaven ended and machinery began. At 13:20, the last German bunker on that section of beach fell silent. The air cover pulled higher, circling, waiting. Then, abruptly, the roar began to fade. The silence that followed was almost painful. Men lifted their heads, unsure whether to trust it. The sea continued its slow, grinding applause against the shore. Alton stood beside his ruined post, binoculars hanging loose. The smoke cleared enough to show rows of American flags moving inland. He didn't curse, didn't move. "They own the air," he said quietly. "And when you own the air, you own the world." By 1400 hours, the sky finally went still. The engines were gone, the echoes fading. Only the gulls remained, calling over the wreckage like mourners. The soldiers on both sides looked upward one last time and understood. When the sky grew quiet, it wasn't peace that followed. It was revelation. The war no longer belonged to the earth. The sky had become its new master. Evening came late to Normandy, as if the day itself refused to die. Smoke hung low over the fields, and the sky glowed not from the sun but from the fires below. From the beaches to the hedgerows, everything flickered in shades of orange and ash. It was not sunset. It was the earth still burning. A German infantryman, Erich Müller, sat on the edge of a trench, his hands black with soot. He opened a small notebook and wrote by the light of a shattered truck still smoldering nearby, "The sun is setting, but the sky does not darken. It burns. Even the night, it seems, fights for them." He paused, looked upward. The stars were gone, swallowed by smoke. The silence between explosions felt heavier than the noise had ever been. Around him, the survivors of his unit moved like ghosts. Some dragged bodies, others sat staring at nothing. Orders came half-whispered, more out of habit than hope. A captain muttered, "Reinforcements at dawn," but no one answered. The horizon glowed red from end to end, as if the continent itself was bleeding. Across the channel, the surviving Allied pilots landed on rain-dark runways in southern England. Their aircraft taxied in under blackout lights, metal groaning, engines coughing out the last fumes of war. Mechanics climbed onto wings, tracing the new holes with grease-stained fingers. One, a corporal from Kansas, whispered, I don't know how they made it back. Maybe the sky just got tired of killing. Lieutenant Carter sat on the wing of his Spitfire, helmet still on, staring into the ground. His skin was pale where the goggles had been. When a mechanic handed him a mug of coffee, he took it without a word. The air smelled of hot oil and victory that didn't feel like victory. The hangar lights flickered, painting the tarmac gold and gray. Someone laughed, too loud, and stopped halfway. In a half-ruined building outside Cannes, the remaining Luftwaffe staff gathered by candlelight. The walls shook with distant detonations. Major Reinhardt stood before a torn map. "We have lost France," he said quietly. Another officer corrected him, "No, sir. We lost the sky." Reinhardt nodded, eyes hollow. "It was not a battle," he said. "It was an eclipse." Outdoors, the countryside gleamed with twisted wrecks, gliders, planes, and burned vehicles reflecting the firelight. Even the trees shone as if coated in bronze. Muller closed his notebook and folded the page into his pocket. The glow from the horizon lit one side of his face, making his features look carved from metal. On the Allied side, officers reviewed the day's reports under dim lamps. The words on the maps blurred from exhaustion. "We took the beaches," someone said. "At what cost?" another replied. No one answered. The silence between them felt heavier than any shell. Outside, the horizon still pulsed red, a living heartbeat of destruction. By 10 o'clock, true night should have fallen. Yet darkness never came. Flames from the coast climbed into the clouds and turned them amber. Pilots lying awake mistook the reflection for dawn. Soldiers miles inland walked without lanterns, the glow was enough. A French farmer's child whispered, "The sky looks alive." His mother only nodded, her eyes wet from the smoke. Reinhardt, standing by the window of his ruined bunker, watched the horizon pulse. He thought of the early morning stillness before the invasion, how calm the air had been. "We mistook silence for control," he murmured. "Now even silence belongs to them." Behind him, the candles guttered out one by one. Past midnight, the fires began to fade, but the light refused to die. It lingered above the coast like a bruise, vast and slow. Along the cliffs, men stopped moving and simply stared upward, unable to tell where flame ended and heaven began. That night, the sky never turned dark. It only grew tired of shining. June 1944. The roar had ended, but its echo stayed. Across Normandy, the sky was quiet for the first time in days, yet the silence carried its own weight, a silence that pressed against walls, hearts, and sleep. The air still smelled of iron and burnt earth. The wind, when it came, moved gently, as if afraid to touch what was left. At a field hospital nearby you, rows of tents shimmered in the afternoon heat. Flies buzzed over trays of morphine syringes. Nurses moved between cots like shadows. One of them, Lieutenant Helen Ward, later wrote in her journal, "They returned and said nothing. I tried asking what they'd seen, but the words never came. Some just stared at the canvas ceiling, others at their hands. It was as if the sky had followed them back here." The pilots lay on stretchers, uniforms streaked with oil and smoke. When they slept, their hands twitched, still gripping invisible throttles. One man woke screaming, shouting coordinates, then fell back into silence. Another refused to remove his helmet, saying the noise outside felt too empty without it. At a nearby airbase, mechanics worked without speaking. The hangars smelled of hot metal and rain. P-51 Mustangs stood in neat lines, their fuselages scarred and blackened. Lieutenant Raymond Hale, his flight jacket still damp with sweat, gave a half-smile to the crew chief and said, "I didn't see the enemy today. I saw motion. Endless motion. We weren't fighting men, we were fighting the sky itself." That night, the base dining hall was almost full but nearly silent. A radio played faintly, the voice of an announcer describing success in measured tones. "The landings have been secured. Our air forces dominate the skies." The men kept eating, spoons scraping enamel plates. No one applauded. Victory was a sound they no longer trusted. Miles away, in a makeshift Allied headquarters near the coast, officers reviewed after-action reports. Numbers covered the pages: targets destroyed, aircraft lost, sorties completed, but none of it captured what the airmen had seen. A young intelligence clerk looked up and asked his superior, "So it's over?" The colonel closed the file and replied, "No. We just ran out of sky." In another tent, a German officer sat on a folding chair, hands bound, his uniform torn and blackened. An American interpreter offered him water. He took it, drank, then said in perfect English, "Your planes, they were not just flying. They were everywhere. Even when they weren't, we heard them." He paused, staring at the dirt floor. "We thought we were fighting soldiers. But we were fighting sound, wind, and light." The interpreter didn't answer. There was nothing left to argue. Back at the hospital, Helen Ward made her rounds by lantern light. The patients talked in fragments, about the smell of fuel, the way the sky changed color when the bombs fell, the silence afterward that felt worse than the noise. She tried to comfort them, but even her voice seemed small, fragile against the weight of what they carried. Outside the tents, the night was clear at last. The moon shone over the distant sea, pale and indifferent. For the first time since the invasion, stars were visible. Some soldiers looked up, almost surprised to see them. A mechanic lying on a patch of grass whispered, "It's strange, it's the same sky, but I don't trust it anymore." Hale walked to the edge of the airfield, boots crunching on gravel. Planes rested in rows behind him, silent giants under canvas covers. He looked east, where faint flashes still pulsed over the French coast. The war hadn't ended, only changed shape. He thought about what it meant to own the sky, to use it as a weapon, to make it scream. And he wondered what it had taken from those who ruled it for a single day. Inside the hospital tent, one of the wounded pilots stirred in his sleep and whispered through cracked lips, "Still flying, still falling." Helen leaned over him, brushed dust from his forehead, and whispered back, "You're on the ground now." But even as she said it, she could hear the faint echo of engines somewhere far away, or maybe only in her head. By morning, the sea fog returned, soft and gray, wrapping the camp in quiet. The world looked calm again, deceptively so. Men shaved, repaired boots, wrote letters home. Life resumed, though the air still trembled with memory. In the silence that followed, no one cheered. No one cried. The only sound left was the distant hum of wind across the runways, steady, endless, almost human. For the first time, they understood. The sky could be both battlefield and prison. July 1944. London. The war room smelled of tobacco, ink, and sleeplessness. Ceiling fans turned lazily over rows of officers bent across maps covered in red threads and black pins. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but inside these walls, the weight of the numbers was unbearable. Typed reports from Normandy arrived by courier, crisp, official, merciless. One sheet listed only 2 figures. Allied sorties, June 6, 14,674. German sorties, 319. No adjectives, no sentiment, just arithmetic that described the end of an era. A British analyst underlined the totals and murmured, 14,000 to 300. It wasn't a battle. It was a surrender written in the sky. In another office, across the channel, the remnants of the Luftwaffe were trying to make sense of their defeat. The archives of the French sector were being packed for transport east. Between piles of folders, a sergeant found a letter, unsent and water-stained. It was addressed to Mean family. The handwriting trembled. "We no longer fight an army," it read. "We fight a machine built by the sky itself. When it moves, the world moves. When it stops, everything falls silent." The letter was never mailed. The man who wrote it disappeared somewhere near Cannes. Back in London, in a cramped room lit by one bare bulb, Captain William Hale, the same pilot who'd watched Normandy burn, sat for a debriefing. The officer across from him read from a clipboard. You flew 6 sorties that day. Do you recall the number of confirmed targets? Hale shook his head. No, sir. It was all one target. The world below. The officer paused his pencil. You mean the invasion zone? Hale looked at the floor. I mean everything. He left the report and signed. The same evening, a young secretary in the Air Ministry organized photographs for the press, lines of bombers, paratroopers in midair, waves of landing craft moving like gray insects across the channel. She pinned one image to the wall, an aerial shot of Normandy at dawn, the clouds streaked with contrails. She stared at it for a long time before whispering, "It looks like veins." In France, the fires had gone out, but the land still steamed where the heat had sunk into the soil. Engineers cleared the beaches, villagers gathered what remained of their homes. Near St. Lo, an Allied photographer stepped out of his jeep and tilted his camera upward. The sky was bright, perfect, unscarred. Hard to believe, he said to his driver, that this was hell a month ago. The driver didn't answer. They both knew the silence overhead wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. From Berlin came a coded message intercepted by Allied intelligence, rebuilding impossible. Fuel depots destroyed. Morale, uncertain. Analysts didn't celebrate. They filed the message under routine. Victory had become administrative. At the RAF archives weeks later, statisticians compiled a summary of Overlord's first 24 hours. The final report was 3 pages long, ending with one simple conclusion typed in block letters: air supremacy, total. Someone penciled a note in the margin, and what comes after total? No one replied. On a quiet Sunday in late July, Hale flew again, this time not in formation, but alone, ferrying a reconnaissance plane back to England. As he crossed the channel, he glanced down at the coastline that had once burned brighter than day. Now it looked peaceful, even ordinary. He flew low enough to see farmers plowing new fields where the landing zones had been. Children waved from the roadsides. The sea glittered calmly, as if it had never known the taste of oil and blood. He throttled back and let the plane drift over the water, tracing the faint line where dawn met the tide. It's over, his co-pilot said softly. Hale nodded but didn't speak. In his mind he still heard the chorus of engines, the breathing of thousands of machines that had turned the sky into a weapon. He wondered if the world would ever again look small enough to hold. That night, in a briefing room lit by cigarette smoke and fatigue, a senior air marshal addressed his staff: "The age of ground war is ending. The next war will be decided before it begins, up there." He pointed toward the ceiling, though everyone understood he meant something far beyond it. The war would grind on for another year, but the story of the sky was already written. It had begun at 3:57 a.m. on June 6, when radar screens showed a single white smear over France. And it ended here, in the quiet, with men realizing that their victory had come at a cost they could not name. Months later, an Allied correspondent published an essay titled, "The Day the Sky Went to War." The last line read, "When 5,000 planes rose into the dawn, mankind believed it had conquered heaven. But that morning, the sky reminded us, it can fight back." The numbers stayed in the archives, the photographs faded. Only the memory remained. The sound of wings, the trembling of air, and the uneasy truth that for one day, the heavens themselves had been human.